React hooks are functions that we can use to manage state, fetch data, and interact with browser APIs. In this video, we'll explore why you might use hooks and how they can make development more scalable. Let's explore some more ways we can modernize our React code with hooks. One of the most common tools for creating a new React application is Create React App. Create React App will give us a React project structure, the ability to use the latest JavaScript features, and tools for optimizing your app for production. To get started with Create React App, you need to do a couple of things. So first we need to open our terminal. So we're going to type node-v. This will let us know what version it is. As long as you see something higher than 8.10, then you can use Create React App. The next thing I'll check is npm. npm is the node package manager, and we want to make sure that this is version 5, 6, or higher. If you don't see those versions, you can always go to nodejs.org and download the latest. Now that we know that we have the correct versions, what I need to do is I want to get into a folder where I want to run my project. So I'm just going to cd change directory to the folder, and then I'm going to run Create React App using this command called npx. So npx is a package runner that comes with npm that we can use to run something like Create React App without having to install it globally on our computer. So this is really nice. So we'll use npx create react app and then whatever the name of the project is going to be. So I'm going to just call it React Hooks. This might take a little while to install. Now that that's installed, we can change directory into the React Hooks directory and then run npm start. npm start is going to start our project on localhost 3000. So this should pop this open in a new browser window. We can see the starter project running right here. Now if this went really badly for you, and maybe it didn't fully install, or your screen doesn't look like this, or you got a bunch of errors, something that you can do is, you can go to a new window and type react.new. So react.new is going to open up a code sandbox, which is an in-browser IDE that you can use for React development. So if you'd rather follow along in something like this, you can. You will sign in, either using your GitHub or your Google account. So I'll sign in with GitHub here. And it's going to make me do everything to sign in. So now that I'm logged in, I can start to make some changes. Hello world. And as soon as I do that, we're going to see that render in the output. So this is a really cool way to get started with a React project quickly. If you don't want to work with the files locally, you can always work with them here. As soon as you save it to, it's going to fork the sandbox so that you have your own URL to always refer back to. Whether you're working with the code sandbox here in the browser, or if you're working with the project locally, you're ready to go. With this setup, we're going to look at how to create a component. We looked at how we can use Create React App to generate a React project for us. So let's take a little look at what's going on here. So inside of our package.json file, we have React, and then we have some testing dependencies. In our index.js file, we have this service worker that I'm actually going to delete, because we don't need it. I'm going to delete kind of any evidence of a service worker. I also wanted to point this out. So in recent versions of React, React strict mode has been a wrapper that you can use on components. The benefit of wrapping your component with React strict mode is it's going to give you warnings. So the next thing I want to do here is, let's open up our app.js file. Let's go ahead and get rid of everything inside of it. And then, let's just add in each one here, and we'll say hello world. And now, as soon as we do that, it should immediately render to the browser. So, that's really all we need in the way of setup. Again, our app component here is being rendered by the React DOM render. So here, we really have everything we need to get started. The most common place that object destructuring is used in React is inside of the component. So here we have a component that's rendering hello world, but we also can pass into any one of these components an object called props. So that means that I can replace world with props.name. Then I can go back to our index file. I can pass in a name property. Let's say Alex. And then our component will render with the dynamic data. One way that we can shorten up our syntax here is we can destructure the props object. And I can use destructuring to pop out just the name. So now if we hit save, no changes, but everything is working as expected. Destructuring is also used with arrays, and it's used quite a bit with React hooks. So let's consider in our index file an array of people. So we'll create an array of people. Let's say Alex, Ali, and Anna. Now, typically, if we wanted to access the first item in this array, we'd use its position. So for example, we could console log people and then grab the first item. Now if we open up our console, we'll see there's Alex there. Similarly, if we wanted to grab, say, Anna, we would access them by their position in the array. So here's where destructuring can help. Instead of accessing by position, what I can do is I can use array destructuring here. So I'm going to replace people with an array, and then I'm going to create a variable name that I want to use to access the first item. So the first item that I add here will correspond to the first item in the array. So let's try logging this again, and we'll get rid of that second console log. And we see there's Alex. Similarly, I could add a second one and we'll say console log second. Alex Ali. And then, another really cool thing you can do is, let's say you only want the third item in the array. You don't care about naming any of the other ones. You can do something kind of cool, where you can add 2 commas and those will stand in for Alex and Ali, and then you can name the third. Then I can console log third. There we go. This syntax is really useful to be able to assign actual names to positions in an array. Destructuring assignment can be used with objects and arrays, and having an understanding of both are going to help you work more effectively with modern React. Another way that we can take advantage of useState is to use it in combination with inputs. Here we're going to make the status of a checkbox, checked or unchecked, a state variable. So the first thing we want to do is, let's get rid of our old code here. We'll get rid of that useState call. Then inside of this div, we're going to add an input. And the input is going to have a type, and that type is checkbox. And then we also want to create a state variable. So this time it's going to be checked and set checked. We'll call useState, and then the initial state is going to be false. So now I can use the value of checked inside of this input. So I'll say that the value is checked. Let's also add a paragraph tag next to this, and we'll say, if it's checked, then say checked, otherwise display not checked. Okay, so at this point, it shows our initial state that's working as we expect it to, but we're still not seeing the actual click work. So what we can do is let's add an onChange event to our input. And the onChange is going to, as we saw before, it's going to call setChecked. And what we can pass in here is whatever the opposite of checked is. There we go. It's usually a good idea to look at whatever the value of this variable is, to check the checked variable if you will, and then return the opposite. So this is just a little enhancement that we can make, not much of a change, but checked and unchecked are going to work as we click. So there we go. We've created a checkbox component, and we're using the useState hook to help us keep track of the value of checked. More often than not, our React applications are not a single component. So, working with state in a component tree is really an important concept to know about. So, what we're going to build is a star rating component, so that we can rate anything: books, movies, restaurants. We can use it all over, all different types of applications. Now, the app component is going to be responsible for just rendering another component. So the app component here, let's go ahead and say, return star rating. We actually want to create it using a smaller component called a star. So the star component is going to be what makes up all of these star rating components. And the star that we want to use is actually from a separate library called React Icons. So let me go ahead and import it first, and then we're going to install it using npm. So over here in my terminal window, I need to run npm install React Icons. And we'll just let that install over here, kind of in the background. Let's go back to our component. And now the star is going to return fa star. So fa star is just one of the many icons that React Icons applies, so you can use it for all sorts of different things. The star rating component is going to return a certain number of stars. So in order to create an array of stars that can be displayed on the page, we need to create a little helper function here called createArray. CreateArray is going to take in the length, so that's just how many stars we want to create. And it's going to return an array with that number of items. It's going to create an array of whatever length that is. Now what I can do is I can create our function called star rating. Star rating is going to use that createArray function, and then we're going to map over this. We'll supply n and I. The I is going to help us with the key. Alright, so now we have these stars rendering on the page. That's fairly cool, but we can make this one step better by changing the properties a little bit. So let's take a look at the first place to change those properties. First, I'm going to pass total stars into the star rating component. And I'm going to say that this is a 10-star component. Now, instead of just hard coding this, I'm going to say that total stars should be the value that's passed to createArray. And there we go, we have 10 stars. Let's also add a default property here. So I'll say total stars equals 5, so that if total stars aren't passed, we're going to use 5 as the default. But if we pass 10, it's going to use whatever the user passes. Now the final thing I want to add here is I want to add a property for color. So eventually we're going to be able to click on these stars and change their color. We're going to say selected equals false, and then inside of our star component, we'll add a property called color. And then we'll say if selected, we want to make this red, otherwise let's make it gray. So now all of these stars are gray, and when I select them eventually, they're going to turn red. Now we'll make that happen, and just as a spoiler, we're going to use useState. We've used React properties to get us this far. We've created a few different stars. Now, what we need to do is we need to handle clicking on them. In order to do this, we're going to create a state variable using useState. So we're still importing useState from React. And then if I scroll down a little bit to our star rating component, this is where I'm going to manage the state. So first we're going to create a constant here. We'll call this selected stars and set selected stars. Those are long variable names, but they're descriptive, so we'll stick with that. As an initial state, we want to provide 0. So we'll say that when our component renders, we don't want to have any of these be selected. Now we need to supply these properties to each one of the stars, because the star is actually the component that's being clicked. We want to make sure it has access to this state variable. So I can pass to the star a property called selected. This looks familiar from here. So selected here is going to set selected stars as greater than I. This is going to keep track based on the index of how many stars are selected. Then we're going to add this function called onSelect. So similar to our functions from before that change state, we're going to need to use that setSelectedStars function. And inside of this function, let's go ahead and call setSelectedStars. And then how we want to select the star is by using its index plus 1. Because we're using a 0-based index in JavaScript, we need to make sure that we're capturing that correctly. The final thing I need to do is, I need to pass this function to each star, because like I said, that's where the clicking is actually going to happen. So first we'll pass the property. Then here, let's add the onClick, which will just be set equal to onSelect. So that will call this setSelectedStars function. So now, if we click on any one of these stars, it's going to capture that correctly. And then, if I wanted to change the total stars to something a little more realistic, we can do so. Let's zoom way in on that. We see that every time I click one of those stars, the state changes. And we can make this even more clear if we want to, by adding a fragment here, around our createArray function. Let's first wrap it in a JSX expression. Then we're going to wrap this in a fragment. And now we can add, underneath the createArray function, a paragraph that says selected stars of total stars. Zero out of 4, 3 out of 4, 4 out of 4. Pretty cool. So just to recap, we are managing our state with this function called useState. SetSelectedStars is the function we use to change the state, and we've attached this to every single one of these stars so that as I click them, it will change the application state. Another hook that is exported by the React library is useEffect. UseEffect allows you to perform side effects in function components. So a side effect could be something like a console log, or it could interact with some kind of DOM API like history or window. First, we want to adjust our component here. I'm going to get rid of everything related to our star. And then we're going to replace our star rating with a section. And the section will have a paragraph that says congratulations. And now we want to see that printed out. Perfect. So then we can use useEffect, but in order to use useEffect, we really need to set up a state variable. So first we'll set up a name and a function to change the state called setName. Then we'll call useState with some sort of an initial value. The initial value we'll use here is Jan. Now when we create that variable, we can then display the name inside of this string. Congratulations, Jan. Then let's create a button. So the button is going to say change winner. So whoever is the winner will be reflected in the UI. Then we're going to add an onClick handler here and we'll pass in a function that's going to set the name. It'll set the name to Will. Now when I change the winner, it'll say congratulations Will. Now, this is all stuff we're familiar with because we've already used useState, but here's where useEffect comes in. We're going to use this function called useEffect, and useEffect takes in a function. It's going to look like this to get us started. Then we also need to be sure to import useEffect from React. Okay, so what we want useEffect to do is, we want to have it change the document title. This is the default document title, React App, right here. So what I can do is I can just say document title equals celebrate name. When I refresh, it says celebrate Jan, and then if I click change winner it says congratulations Will. And also it's called this useEffect because it's changed the document title to reflect that. Now by default, this runs after each render and every update, and this may not always be what you want. Next, we'll learn how to customize when these useEffect functions fire. As we saw every time we change the state, this useEffect call fires, but there's something that can help us out with this. Let's go ahead and pass another argument to this useEffect function, and the argument is just going to be an empty array. Notice how the name changes in the DOM, but the effect is not called. So when we pass an empty array, it means that the effect will only fire once on first render. You also can pass the name of the variable in here. I could say name, and then when I change the winner, it will follow up by changing the document title. This is particularly useful if you're dealing with more than one state variable. I'm going to change the document title to a console log message, and then I'll say celebrate name. We'll add another useEffect here. This will take in another function. And this time we'll say console.log the user is. And we need to create another state variable too. We'll call these admin and setAdmin, and then the initial state will be false. So this console log message is going to say, the user is. We'll use a template here, and we'll check the value of admin. If it's admin, we'll say admin. And then if not, we'll say not admin. Okay, so let's go back. And now we have two different state variables. Let's also add another paragraph and another button. So here if it's an administrator, then return logged in. Otherwise return not logged in. And then this button will say login. And then onClick should call that setAdmin function to change the state to true. Okay, so we have a lot of stuff going on here, and what we're noticing right away is that these have fired. These useEffect calls have fired on first render. But let's go ahead and remove this dependency array from our first useEffect. So I'll give that a save, celebrate Jan, user is not admin. We see the new state, celebrate Will. But we're still getting this message too. We'll say, call this one anytime the name changes. And then the second one here. We'll say, call this one anytime the admin changes. Now I change the winner, and we just logged celebrate Will. I changed login, and it just logs the second use effect. So this dependency array is really useful. We don't want to be running code that we don't have to be. We want to be really specific about which effects should be called when, and we can help do so with this dependency array. Another use case for useEffect is for data fetching. Let's say we had an API like api.github.com/users, so this is just a straight-up REST API. It returns some JSON data, and we want to make a request for this data and then load it into our page. The way I can do that is by using a combination of useState and useEffect. The first thing we'll do is we will update our component quite a bit, and let's just start literally from scratch with this thing. We'll still import useState and useEffect, but inside of this app component now, we want to create a state variable for data and set data. And then, on first render, we want useState the initial state just to be an empty array. Then, we're going to say return a paragraph that says no users. Now if we look at our app, it says no users. It's going to be up to us to get the data from that API using a useEffect call. UseEffect always takes in a function. We're going to use fetch, which takes in the URL of the API. api.github.com/users, literally the same thing as this. Once we've fetched, we need to call then, and we'll take that response and we'll pass it as JSON. So response.json, the function should return that. Then, and here's what's real cool, we can say .then. And we're going to call setData. We could say response, setData with the response, or we can just literally pass in setData. That's kind of a shortcut that we can use if we'd like to. If there's some data, we want to return an unordered list, you want to map over all these users and display their username. So we'll say data.map, and then for each user, we want to add a list item, and for each one of these list items, we want to say user.login. Alright, so let's try that again, login, and there we go. We also, because we have the IDs for all of these people, we probably getting that dreaded error. So what we can do is we can say key equals user.id. And that should be cleared. Nice. We're also getting this warning coming from React hooks telling us that we need to add a list of dependencies, so that we don't have this infinite chain of updates. There's a possibility every time we're using useEffect that if we don't handle the dependency array correctly, then we're going to continuously make this useEffect call to that API. We're going to add an empty array here to useEffect so that it's only called once on page load. Now, what happens if we want to make this a little bit more interesting? Let's wrap our UL with a div so that we can add a button. And this button, which will say remove data. Let's add an onClick to it, and the onClick is going to call setData. And remember, all these functions take in a new state. So our new state is going to be an empty array. But what happens if I remove that dependency array? I'll scroll to the bottom again. I'll say remove data. And it's constantly flickering. It's constantly trying to load it again. So there's a bunch of extra HTTP requests going on here that are being caused by us not supplying this empty array. So that's how you use useEffect to load data. And always remember that dependency array, so you don't take down your APIs with too many HTTP requests. In addition to useState, there's another way to manage state variables. And that is another one of these hooks called useReducer. So first, let's import useReducer, and we're going to do a little bit of cleanup here as usual. Instead of returning all that data, we're going to return just an EQ1, and the EQ1 should say a number. So the number that we want to display is going to relate to useReducer here. So let's say const number, and then set number. This is the function that's going to change the state. This is the state variable. But useReducer is going to look slightly different. Instead of taking in just an initial state, it's going to take in 2 arguments. So the first argument is actually a function, and the second argument is the initial state. So the initial state for this number is going to be 0. The function that we're going to send as the first argument to useReducer is going to be what we want to have happen when setNumber is called. So what we want to do is, we want to take the number and the new number in as arguments, and then we want to return the number plus the new number. So that looks really bad until I save it, but there we go. We have our number and our new number. 0 is the initial state. So how do we know that this is going to work? Well, we're going to use that setNumber function in the onClick. So we'll say setNumber, and then we'll pass in 1. And then every time I click on this EQ1, it's going to increment the number. It just takes in this number. It combines it with the old number. And it returns a new number. So this is how we're adding this together. So useReducer, again, it takes in 2 different things. First is a function that is going to return some sort of new state. And then an initial state is the second value. So next we'll take a look at a component that should look familiar. And we're going to refactor it using useReducer, so we can understand more of what's going on here. Earlier, we created a checkbox, and we handled the check state by using useState. So every time I click on this checkbox, we call the setChecked function. And then we look at whatever the value of checked is, and we return the opposite. We can refactor this a little bit using useReducer, which may help with potential bugs. Instead of importing useState, let's import useReducer, and we'll replace it here. Now the second thing I want to do is, I want to call this function toggle. And then inside of the useReducer function, again, it takes in 2 things. It's going to take in that function. That's going to change the state. So literally, I want to just pull this nice little function here. This is going to be my reducer. So let's paste that. Then I'm going to say that false is the initial state. So instead of using setChecked in this onChange, we're going to replace this function with toggle. So now it's going to work the exact same way. Now what's really nice about this is, instead of having to embed this logic into all of these onChange events, we can sort of abstract this away into its own function. We know that every time we call toggle, we should do this. As your state gets more complex, it can be nice to consolidate your functionality into a useReducer call. This makes it a little easier to understand, and a little easier to work with. Another pattern you can use with useReducer is to define a list of actions, and then dispatch them in the component. So this will look a little different. We'll first start by adjusting our component. So inside of this component, we want to return a message. And we want this message to display whatever the state of this message value is. Inside of the useReducer function, we're going to scaffold this to say a couple different things. So it's first going to take in the state. And then it's going to take in this method called dispatch. Then useReducer will take in a reducer and an initial state. So we'll define these outside of these parentheses. Now, the easier part of this is to define the initial state. So let's go ahead and do that. The initial state here will be a message that says hi. So once we've created an initial state, that'll be passed into this function. Then we're going to go ahead and create a reducer. A reducer takes in state and an action, and then it returns a new state. So the way that I can define which state it should return is with the switch statement. So the switch statement is going to take a look at whatever the type of the action is. This means that we can define the list of the possible actions that we could dispatch. So just think of an action as being like some sort of an event. We're going to send a yell action, and the yell action should return a message that says hey, and we're yelling, so all caps. Then we can specify a case for whispering. This time we'll return another object. Our message is excuse me. Very polite, very quiet. Now that we have our reducer defined, our message is displaying here using our initial state. But what I'm really here to do is to try to dispatch some actions. So let's scroll down. We will add some UI elements that we can use to trigger these changes. So we'll say yell. And here we're going to say on click equals, and again, we're going to dispatch an action of a specific type. And the type of action we want to dispatch is yell. So this is what that'll look like. Type yell. There we go. And let's create another one of these buttons. It'll look pretty much identical except it should say whisper. Let's make it all lowercase cause it's very quiet. Then we'll say whisper inside of the action. And now I can say whisper and it's say excuse me. Now, the reducer function takes in the state and an action and returns a new state. And while this is working okay, the real benefit of having access to that previous state is so that we can use it. So if our new state relies on the old state, this is a really good pattern to use. So I'm going to change this message to a template string. And I'm going to say hey, I just said state.message. So this is going to display whatever the previous state of message is. So now if I click on yell again, it'll say hey, I just said hi. So similarly, I could do the same here. So we could say excuse me, I just said state.message. So now if I click whisper, it should show me what the previous state was. So this can be really useful in calculations or checking in with the previous value to make sure that you're returning the new thing that's correct, but this is what a reducer is for. It takes in the state and an action, and it returns a new state. And anytime our state starts to become a little more complex, we can reach for use reducer to help us out. As we move our way through all of these different hooks that the React library provides us with, one that we can't overlook is useRef. So useRef is going to allow us to reach out to a component and determine its value. And this can be extremely useful, particularly with forms. So the first thing I want to do with our form is I want to import useRef. I'll get rid of all of our reducer stuff from before. Then inside of the component, instead of returning this here, we're going to say form and we'll close the form. Inside the form, I want to add an input with a type of text, and then we'll add another one of these with a type color. Yeah, so we have our little input fields, and then we have a little color picker. Let's also create a button, and the button should have text that says add. So this is going to allow us to add a color. Now what we really want to track in this case is we want to track whatever the user inputs into this field. So the thing that they'll input here. I'll add a placeholder just for good measure. We want to catalog a sound, and whatever we think the closest color to that sound might be. Now if we want to be able to reach out to this form element and grab whatever the user types in. So Screech or something like this, I need to be able to access this and capture it somewhere. So we're going to call useRef to find that. So we'll say const sound equals useRef and then const color equals useRef also. Now the way that we attach these to the form elements is we just add another attribute called ref. And we attach that to whatever the name of the ref is. So ref equals color. Next, I need to handle submitting this form. I'm going to create a function called submit. And this takes in the event, so the submission of the form. The reason I need this is because I want to prevent the default behavior of the page. In other words, I want to prevent the page from reloading as soon as I click that form. Now in order to grab this value like Screech, what I need to do is I need to create another variable called soundValue. This is going to be set equal to sound.current.value. And the .current.value is what's provided to us by this useRef function. So once we create one of these for the sound, we'll do one for color. And then we'll say color.current.value. Now we want to not really do much with this, but I just want to make sure that I can capture this value. So let's just alert it. So I'll say sound value sounds like color value. Okay, then I'm going to use this in the form. So I'll say on submit equals submit. Okay, so let's see if our alert is working. So what's really cool about this is we're going to be able to check in with the values of these form elements. And at this point, all I'm doing is alerting them. But you can think about how you might pass these off to your database or some other sort of external process that's running. You can capture user input. So now that I've alerted this, as soon as I saw that alert, I still see the name and the color. So let's reset this. We can say sound.current.value equals empty string. Color.current.value equals empty string also. So now, if I try that again and I say Screech, and that's more of a red, I think. So we'll add that Screech sounds like whatever, click OK. And all that's cleared out. So useRef is going to be particularly helpful when we're working with forms. And you can use these to capture values from any input. Another way to handle inputs in a form is to use a controlled component. A controlled component means that you handle form inputs using state variables. So let's refactor our form component to make this work. Now here, instead of useRef, I want to use state. So it'll look like this. Sound and set sound equals useState, and then this'll just be an empty string as its initial state. And then we'll say const color and set color equals useState. And our initial state here will just be black. So it was 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Now, we can get rid of both uses of useRef and instead replace it with useState here. The next thing I need to do is let's adjust our component a little bit. So instead of ref sound, it's going to be value sound. Instead of ref color, value color. Then we're going to add an onChange event. This will take in E for the event, and then we'll say set sound of E.target.value. Then we can use the same thing, but instead of set sound, it's going to be set color. So now, our inputs are going to be in charge of changing the state. Now the final thing we need to do here is, let's remove any evidence of our refs here. And again, just to make sure that this is working, we want to check the sound and the color. And then upon submitting the form, we can reset the state. So I can say set sound is empty string. Set color as 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Okay, so let's see how we're doing here. We have created these state variables for sound and color. We have adjusted our submit function to just alert whatever the sound and color and state are, and then reset the sound and color when the form is submitted. And then each one of these inputs have their own onChange properties that change the state. So now what we can do is, we can say screech and this time it'll be a green color. And now when I add it, it should alert this and then clear it out. So there you have it. We're handling our form input values by assigning them to state values. Next, we'll take this one step further and abstract this functionality into a separate function. In addition to the pre-built hooks that are supplied by the React library, you can also create your own custom hooks. If there's ever a place where you're writing a lot of the same code in your components, it might be possible to extract the logic into a hook. For example, for these input elements, we're kind of doing the same thing. We're just getting and resetting the value. The field takes something in, then we grab it and send it somewhere and then reset the field's value. So we're going to do all of this instead of in this component, in a custom hook called useInput. So the first thing we need to do is create a file called useInput. So it'll be called useinput.js, and we'll put it right here in the source folder. Now the next thing that we'll do is we'll import useState from React. Now, we're allowed to use hooks inside of other hooks or in components, so this is a great place to use one. Now we need to think about what we want our input to do. So the first thing is, it's a function that's going to take in an initial value. Let's zoom that out a little bit. Then we're going to use value and set value as the state variable, and the function to change the state. And then the initial value is what we'll send to the useState function. Now our useInput has to return something. So like when we call useState, we know that it returns a pair. It returns an array of a value and a function to change the value. Now what we want this one to return is, we want it to return first, an object that has the value and an onChange. And the onChange here is going to set the value. It's going to call the setValue function. That's going to change the state. So e.target.value. Now, the other thing I need to add here is a function that's going to do the cleanup. So remember our function that reset the value of the input? This is what's going to make that happen here. So we'll say setValue is whatever the initial value was. So set it back to 0, or an empty string or that black color, whatever you want to do. Now that we've created this hook, we can use this hook anywhere. So we'll use it first, of course, in our app. So let's open up the index file again. We want to import in our index.js file the useInput hook. UseInput. Now instead of using useState here, we're going to use useInput. So here, we're going to create a value called title props. Then we're going to create a value called reset title. And we're going to say use input, and then we'll pass it an initial value, which is an empty string. So remember, use input returns an array. The first item in the array is an object with the value and onChange, so these are the properties for that input. And then the second value is how we're going to reset the title or reset the value of the field. Same goes for this one. We'll say color props and reset color. And then we'll say use input, but we'll still pass that hex value. So now we need to adjust all of these values that are part of our submit and are part of our form so that it can now work nicely with use input. So we still want to call that submit function when we submit the form. Instead of value though, we're going to replace this with a JSX expression and we'll push in all of the props from title. So because our function to change the state comes from title props, we can also remove the onChange. Next, we're going to remove the onChange from input, and then we'll replace the value with another one of these sets of curly braces, color props, and we'll click Save. Let's say title props.value sounds like color props.value. And we want to call reset title and reset color. Okay, so let's give that a shot. The sound will be piano, and that kind of sounds bluesy. Piano sounds like that. We'll click OK, and that'll reset everything. So we've abstracted a bunch of logic into a custom hook. And what this means is that, if we ever have an input anywhere in our app, we can just import this useInput function. And it'll work. Then inside of our index file, inside of our app component, we can push in all of the title props, which just means that each of these inputs have access to the state value, as well as the function to change the state. There are times when we want values to be available to the entire component tree. Instead of passing data up and down the tree, we can put the data in context so that all of the child components will know the values that are being passed down. So if you've worked with context in React before, this is kind of the new way to do it using React hooks. So let's go ahead and create a component that's going to consume some data from context. This is going to involve getting rid of our useInput stuff. That served us well, but we're ready to move on. And we also want to import createContext from React. Now, createContext is what we're going to use here. We're going to say export const trees context, so we're going to create this context. It's just like this little container, where we're going to be able to store some data that can be consumed by any of the components that are part of the component tree. The data that we want to create here is going to be an array of objects, and this is going to be super simple. But we'll have an id for each one and a type maple. And I'll copy and paste a few of these so I have 4 of them. The ids will be 1, 2, 3, 4. And then oak. What are some other trees? Family tree and component tree. Cool. So now what we can do is we want to make all of this data accessible to our entire app. I'm actually going to replace React strict mode. And I'm going to wrap my entire app component in the trees context.provider. So this part, the name of the context you create. You can call it whatever you want to, but then we use the provider and provider sounds like it is. It's just going to provide the data to the app component and anything nested below it. So now we need to supply a property called value, and we're going to pass in the trees so that our component has access to that data. So once we supply that data via the value property, we can use the data inside of the component. So how do we access this data? Well, let's go ahead and adjust our app a little bit, and we just want to say div1. Eventually, I want to display these trees that I've heard of, and this will give me an array of these trees, but if I move this to a different file, it wouldn't know what those values were. Next, we're going to take a look at how we can use the data from this array that has been passed down by the provider inside of a nested component. Previously, we looked at how to pass data down to child components via the provider. Now, we're going to learn to read from context using a hook. So, to make this work even nicer, let's move this app component out of the index, and we're going to move it to its own file. So here we're going to replace this function. We're going to then import it. So we'll say import app from app. And hopefully this will mimic what it's really like to work on a project with context a little bit more. So if we go back over to our app component, we need to take that data from context and make it accessible in this component. So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to import the trees context from /. So just that index file. Now, what we can do is we can pull in the useContext hook from React. You might guess where this is going. We're going to call const, I'll say result equals useContext. And then we'll pass in the name of the context that we're interested in. Let's then console log the result. I'm just curious about what this looks like. So this is returning an object that has trees as one of the keys. So now what I can do is I can destructure trees from that result. Then inside of the component, I can add an unordered list. I can map over trees. And then for each one of these trees, I want to return a list item. Each list item will have a type. We know that we have that key prop error, so let's fix that. So we'll say key equals tree dotted, nice. So we've cleared out that warning, that's all good. We have displayed some data, and we've pulled it in, using the useContext hook. So keep in mind that in any component, if we have 1,000 components in our component tree, that's a lot of components. But you know what I mean? Any component that is part of the app, because it's been wrapped in the provider, we're going to be able to read the value of trees simply by calling useContext. It's also possible to create a custom hook to make this even more reusable. So what I want to do here is import useContext into the index.js file. So we're here in index.js, and we're importing useContext. The second thing is, we still will want to create the context, but we don't need to export it, so we won't be using it in a different file. What we will want to export is a constant called useTrees. Now this is our custom hook. That's going to return useContext with the trees context. So this is going to make all of this data accessible to the component, but when we use it in the component, We're not going to call useContext with trees contexts, cause that's a lot of typing. All we really want to do is we want to say import useTrees from /, and then we're going to call useTrees. So now the output is the same. All of the data is the same. I can get rid of useContext here. useTrees is simply going to allow us to reuse this functionality inside of components all over our app. So far, we've fetched data with useEffect, and we've also loaded some state data with useContext. Next, we're going to take a look at how to fetch data with a custom hook. So let's kind of think about the process of fetching data. If we go back to our index file and we get rid of some of this context stuff, what we're really trying to do is handle one of three states. So if the data isn't available yet, but is loading, we have a state for if we get the data. And we have a state for if there's an error. So since all of these states exist with the request, we can wrap this inside of a hook. Let's create a new file called useFetch. So useFetch is going to handle all of these different states. We first need to import useState and useEffect from React. And then this function is going to be exported. useFetch will take in a URI of some sort of API that we want to fetch from. And then again, we need to handle these different states, data and set data, and the initial state will just be null. We also want to handle loading and set loading, and then we want to handle error and set error. Now once we have created these state variables, what we want to do is call useEffect. Remember, this is going to help us fetch that data. So now we can say, if there's not a URI, then we want to just return. So jump out of the function. If we do have one, let's fetch from that URI. We'll call then and we'll take the data and we'll parse it as JSON. And then we'll call setData. We also want to call setLoading and then send it false. So actually the initial state for loading should really be true. When our component first renders, the data is loading. Then when we fetch the data, it's going to be false. And then finally, we'll add a catch here. So if something goes wrong, we want to set the error. So we only want our useEffect to be called when there's a new URI or on the first page load. So finally, we want to return loading data and error. So with this function scaffolded, we can now use it in any component, and we're going to do just that. Now that I have the useFetch hook created, it's time to use it. So let's create an app component again in our index file. Let's also get rid of the provider and instead just render the app. So inside of this app component, we want to display some data from that API. So we'll use the same one from before, and we're also going to pass in the login as a property. So a couple things we need to do here. Remember our useFetch hook takes in the URI for our API. So it's at api.github.com/users. And then we can chain on this little template here and say login. So that's whatever the username for the GitHub user is. So you can use your own or whatever you feel like using. Now useFetch returns, an object with loading, data, and error. So this is going to handle all of these different states. We also can get rid of create context and use context here. Let's just grab that and get it out of the way. Now we need to import useFetch from /usefetch. There we go. And our app component still isn't rendering anything. So let's handle that. So we'll say if loading is true, then we want to return ec1 that says loading. So if you saw that really quickly, it says loading, and then it explodes because there's nothing else to display if loading isn't true. So we need to say, if there's an error we want to return. Let's just return a pre-tag, and it'll say json.stringify. We'll pass the error, null_2 for a little formatting. So we'll take a look at what that looks like in just a second. But the real deal is we want to do something with this data. So we'll return a div inside of the div. We'll add another pre-tag, json.stringify. We'll pass the data null_2 again. So now, this is returning a big object to me. It's saying that the login though is undefined. So what we need to do is we need to pass the login as a property. So this is a string. So I'll just say shreer_it. You can use your own GitHub username if you'd like to. And then this will return all of my data. So, now that we have data coming back, this is often the first step I like to take just to make sure we're getting something before I try to map over it. Especially if I don't know what the shape of the data is. We want to display an image. So that'll use the data.avatar_URL. Let's also add an alt attribute to this image tag. We'll say data.login. So that gives us the image thumbnail. What we can do next is display some personal details. So we'll say ec1 data.login. Then we could say data.name. And then we'll return a p with data.name. So what I'm doing here is I'm just checking to make sure that that name exists. And the reason I do that is because I've used the GitHub API a lot. And I know that a lot of people don't put their name on GitHub or their location. So we can do a check first before it breaks our UI. Alright, so we did it. We have used our useFetch hook. UseFetch returns loading data and error to handle all of these potential states when we're making an HTTP request. And this has really simplified the data in the component. And then I can use this useFetch hook anytime I need to fetch, in my entire application, or even across projects. Thank you for joining me on this journey through React hooks and learning about how they can be applied in various situations. Libraries like React Router, Relay Apollo, and many more use hooks as part of their API. So this video will hopefully set you up for success as you explore other areas of React's ecosystem. If you're looking for more on how to develop your own custom hooks, I'd definitely check out this really cool website called usehooks.com. There you can learn more about how others develop hooks and how you can pick up some tips and tricks to apply to your own projects. Thanks so much for watching this video on React hooks. I wish you all the best as you continue your journey with React well into the future.